And welcome back to Spiritual Strength. Today we're here with the great Thomas Ward, Dr. Thomas Ward, professor at Baylor University, author of Ordered by Love. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Gene.
Absolutely. So I've had a big interest in Scotus, Lesser John Donne's Scotus and Scotism, and I came across a lot of your work, your book, and a lot of your interviews and other shows. I thought it'd be great to have you on, so I'm excited to talk about this.
Yeah, I'm always down for talking about Duns Scotus.
Excellent. Excellent. So I know there was a lot of misunderstandings about him throughout the years. Now talk about, didn't something happen in the 1950s where there was a greater understanding of what he actually taught versus what he didn't, something like that?
Yeah, it was a group set up at the Vatican called the Scotistic Commission I think starting in the 40s and starting in 1950, this group started publishing a critical edition of Scotus's texts. And ironically, this movement to re-examine the actual textual tradition of Scotus probably comes out of the Thomistic revival of Leo XIII and Aeterni Patris, because in addition to like blasting off Thomistic studies, it spurred a kind of movement to go back to scholasticism in general, to understand that period better than it had been in the 19th century. And so kind of coming out of that revival of medievalism, we get the Scotistic Commission, and then it turns out, some of the texts say that Martin Heidegger was relying on when he made various claims about Duns Scotus weren't his at all. And so we're in a much better position now than we were 100 years ago to know just what Scotus said and didn't say.
What are some of the biggest, let's start there. What did he not say that a lot of people think that he did say?
Here's probably the most important thing. Scotus did not say that being is something that God and creatures have in common. And, we could get really in the weeds on the metaphysics here if we want to. I'm happy to go there. But here's the basic idea, like this idea that gets attributed to Scotus, that he believes in the univocity of being. And at some level, it's fine to say that about him. But as long as we don't misunderstand what that's supposed to mean for Scotus, it doesn't mean that he's thinking of something like some generic universal or essence of being that somehow both God and creatures share. Instead, he thinks that God, just as Aquinas taught, God is existence itself. And so every other existent thing, every creature, participates in that existence and is limited and finite, totally dependent on God for its existence and so on. So in that sense, God is being, or God is existence, just as Aquinas would taught. What Scotus means by univocity is that we can form a simple concept of being that we can use when we make statements about God and creatures, when we make arguments that reason from, say, facts about the created order to facts about God's existence or nature. So we have this one concept. So when we say God is a being, that's true. We have to say a lot more than that to avoid misunderstanding. But we could say, yeah, at some like basic level of predication, being does pick out God. It's just not a very interesting thing to say about God. So to sum up, the idea with univocity is that it's the univocity of the concept of being, or the term being, rather than the univocity of being itself. And so once you make that move, you might still disagree with Scotus, right? Like just saying that doesn't mean that you should all accept the univocity of being, but it at least relieves Scotus of this horrible charge that at the top of his metaphysical hierarchy is not God, but being. Like that's the really nefarious thing, that if Scotus really did think that would be bad. It would be idolatrous, as some people accuse Scotus of being. But in fact, he didn't teach that. And so I think that's, probably the thing that, at least among Thomists, the thing that Scotus is most reviled for, univocity of being, actually rests on this pretty fundamental mistake.
Right. So that God does not fall into some kind of genus.
Yeah.
And then talk about that definition. If I remember it correctly, studied it just a little bit now. That being is, Scotus defines as that which is not repugnant to non-being. Did I get that right?
Yeah. So we are in the weeds. Yeah. So if we think about the essence of a thing, like human nature, not considering this or that human, but just considering humanity as such, and we say, okay, that concept, or the concept of that essence, is composed of simpler conceptual components, classically rational animal, right? Now, when we say that sort of essence is possible, that is, like, there can be humans, and in fact there are, what we mean is that those two conceptual components, rational and animal, are not only compatible with each other in the sense like they can go together, unlike square circle, but in the sense that they are jointly compatible with being. So then the full concept of an existent human being would include rational, animal, being, other things, like thisness or Haeceity, which we might get to later. But yeah, so the sort of thing that can be is the sort of thing that is non-repugnant to being, where being is thought of here as, again, as that simple concept.
Right. No, excellent, because that is what you still see a lot of people who mean well. They wrongly identify what Blessed John Duns Scotus means about being, and
Yeah.
and then right there, what I see a lot of people is then a wholesale rejection of anything that Blessed Scotus says.
Yeah, it's like they get the wind up and they can't trust anything after that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So now, is there anything more? Would that be his most general? Well, I guess, where would you start with Scotus, or where do you start with Scotus in terms of his most general view of reality? And then I guess moving more towards the specifics, like you said, I'd love to talk about the will versus the intellect, the absolute primacy, Haeceity, but where do you start at the most general level?
Yeah, Gene, I love this question. I've never been asked it before, and I've never written about it, but it's something I have thought about. What's the most important thing for Scotus? What kind of holds it all together? And I think people might disagree with this, but I think I'm probably on pretty solid ground here. The thing that holds it all together is the utter independence of God from any creature. Now, that sounds sort of bland and metaphysical, but really it underscores how emphatic Scotus is about God's being personal. Like, God has the three persons of the Trinity share this essence that is intellectual, that is free, such that anything ad extra that the Trinity does together is contingent. Like, there's no necessary creation. Now, of course, Aquinas is going to be just as quick to admit that as Scotus is, but that fact, that independence of God from creation, really does sort of like play a more sort of linking role within a lot of different aspects of Scotus's philosophy and theology. For example, there's this common view. Sometimes it's called the Franciscan thesis. Sometimes it's called the predestination of Christ. It's this idea that even if Adam and Eve had never sinned, Christ would have become incarnate anyway. It was like the incarnation is part of the original plan for creation. It wasn't just this afterthought or a solution to fix a problem that wasn't foreseen. And so what we get there is, for one, it's a great way to meditate on God's love of the world and God's love of the created order, this desire to be united with it, not just to fix its problems, but simply to be with us. That in itself is just a beautiful idea. But relative to the independence of God from creatures, the idea is this: it's like God's decision to become incarnate is not conditional on something that creatures do. It's something that he's willing from the start. So that's one way, is you get the sort of connection between Scotus's I think best insights about Christology connected up with his emphasis on divine freedom. More controversially, we get this voluntaristic strain in Scotus's theological ethics. Some people think that he's like practically like William Ockham about God's commands and that sort of thing. And he's not that extreme. Nevertheless, he does have this idea that God, by creating the world, sets up a sort of default moral order that is broadly Aristotelian, but that God's legislative abilities are not fully bound by that Aristotelian moral order. So, for example, God might command us to do things that are that would not be, so to speak, fully revealed simply by reflection on the natural law. So this idea that ethical norms are in some sense contingent, or at least some ethical norms. There are lines here. Some ethical norms are contingent on God's not commanding otherwise. That too is tied to this fundamental view that God is utterly independent from creation. He need not in every way command in accordance with norms that we would discover simply by reflection on the natural law. And I think there are lots of other ways that we can ramify this, but yeah, I think that's really so God's freedom, which is really an emphasis on God's personhood. And this isn't personalism quite, but it is this emphasis on God's personhood. Yeah.
Okay. Now, is this, what's the term that I heard before? Transcendental, or the predicable, what is this, the transcendence? There's something that he speaks about with the qualities, the qualities of God. There's a transcendence, the absolute.
The transcendentals, or
yeah, transcendentals. There they are. Is that similar to that, or is that not really?
It's a little different.
Okay.
Yeah, the idea with the transcendentals is that they are perfections that pertain to every being whatsoever. So infinitely in God, only in a finite way in creatures, but nevertheless sort of transcend, that is, like, go across all of being. So the most famous of these are good and true, and one. Every being, no matter what, has goodness and truth and unity. And then Scotus has to say more about the transcendentals. But so when we talk about, so this term transcendental is used in a slightly different way from this other term we sometimes use, like transcendence, or what is transcendent. And that in itself is not a term that scholastic authors use, like with that particular meaning or connotation, but it's certainly there. So the idea with transcendence is that God is somehow utterly beyond the created order. He's not conditioned by it. He's not dependent on it. And everything that exists that is not God exists because of God. So our concept of transcendence in that more modern sense captures that emphasis in scholastic authors.
Okay, I was probably just mixing up the terms then in my head. So you're saying, but the foundation, or a foundation, the thesis statement, or the where everything emanates, is what you're saying is probably the independence of the radical independence of God, and
Yeah.
from things start branching out. Can you talk maybe about how those different concepts? I know it's a lot there, but Haeceity, the absolute primacy of Christ, and how the univocity of being winds up playing out, and the will versus the intellect from there.
Yeah, let's so think about Haeceity, well, No, let's actually start with the will and intellect stuff, because I already mentioned this voluntaristic theme in
Okay.
Scotus. And when you asked your original question about, what's the biggest misunderstanding of Scotus, I went with univocity, but I might have gone with the voluntarism, because that's also something people complain about. And that one, I think, this is something I've done a lot of work on, trying to understand Scotus's ethical thought and its relationship to divine freedom. And I take a more moderate position on how to understand Scotus's voluntarism, but I recognize, with my like scholar hat on, that there are other scholars who've argued, quite rigorously for that more extreme reading of Scotus. So this is one thing where, like, yeah, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe Scotus did kind of go a little off the rails on this issue. Okay, but voluntarism is a pretty complex sort of concept, and so it's good to distinguish things like theological voluntarism, where mostly we mean God's freedom to legislate, however he wants to, from voluntarism as applied to human beings and human agency. So the unifying notion between theological voluntarism and, so to speak, anthropological voluntarism is this. The two marks of personhood for medieval authors are intellect and will. By our intellect, we have this appetite for the true. By our will, we have an appetite for the good. Of course, they're at bottom, the true and the good are the same thing, but we sort of desire them or pursue them under these different rationes, true and good. All right, so now once you have this kind of faculty psychology where we've sort of, in some sense, compartmentalized the mind into intellect and will, then we can ask questions about how these are related. One idea, sometimes called intellectualism, is that the intellect has a kind of primacy when it comes to freedom and action. So the idea would be whatever intellect apprehends as the good thing to do here and now, the will, since it is blind, so to speak, it needs intellect for guidance, the will just follows on whatever intellect presents to it as the good thing to do here and now. Okay, so at its most extreme version, intellectualism would say that the will is determined to will whatever the intellect presents to it as choice-worthy. Okay, now, as far as I know, there's only one scholastic author who holds that extreme version of intellectualism, and that's a guy named Godfrey of Fontaine. And Thomas Aquinas was an intellectualist, but wanted to resist this full-on determinism of Godfrey. Whether he was fully successful or not is a different story. I mean, we can maybe talk about that later. But then, so then that's intellectualism. But now, suppose you sort of flip the roles of intellect and will, so to speak, and prioritize will over intellect. That view is called voluntarism, from the Latin voluntas, will. So there the idea would be intellect is still, will is still dependent on intellect for, so to speak, having options, like being able to make a discrimination between different courses of action. But the will is not determined in any way by the intellect. So the intellect clearly presents something to the will as the best thing to do here and now. The will can say, nah, I'd rather do something else. So that's voluntarism, sort of in a nutshell. So now think about the God case first, and then I'll say something about the human case. God is thought of here as having intellect and will, but having these, of course, in a totally perfect way. So there's no possible way in which God's willing can go wrong, in which he can fail to do the good. Nevertheless, with respect to himself, like willing what is good for himself, God really cannot do otherwise. Like God can't, according to Scotus, God can't not love himself above all things. It would be a defect in God's will were he to love something else more than himself. So that's it. But when it comes to the created order, Scotus says, God has no practical knowledge. That sounds weird, but practical knowledge here is knowledge about what one ought to do. So when it comes to the created order, Scotus says, God doesn't have knowledge in that sense because there is nothing that God must or ought to do with respect to creatures. So in that sense, God's actions ad extra are determined by God's willing primarily, rather than by God's intellect. So we can imagine like God understanding, due to his omniscience, everything that can be made, created. And nothing that God apprehends when he sees all of those options, so to speak, like calls out to him to determine, determines him on pain of bad willing to make that. So that any choice that God does end up making about creation is just free. It's utterly free. It's just Scotus actually calls this God's liberality. It's this sort of generous giving out. So this is most beautifully expressed in the primacy of Christ. So the soul of Christ is one of the things that God perceives when he perceives everything that he might make. Now, he can recognize by his intellect alone just how beautiful the soul of Christ is, how noble, etc. But none of those facts determine God to do anything with the soul of Christ, to make it or to be united with it or anything. Instead, God just freely loves that particular individual essence more than any other thing he can make, and designs a whole world around it, so to speak. Okay, so that's freedom, that's voluntarism at the highest level. God's the fact that God's knowledge of possible creatures does not determine in any way his willing toward creatures or for creatures. So now in the human case, we can judge something to be a good thing to do, but still not go along with it. This happens all the time, unfortunately. Now Aquinas recognizes that fact just as much as Scotus does, but he explains it slightly differently. Scotus just says, well, the reason why we don't have to do what the intellect tells us to do is simply because the will is free. Now, this gets, at the most extreme limit of this thought is what happens in the beatific vision when we've been glorified and have this cognitive union with God. Is it still metaphysically possible for the will to sort of cease to go on willing God? And Scotus just bites the bullet here, and he says, yeah, that's just the kind of power the will is. It does remain free. Now, we're graced in heaven with the grace of firmness or firmitas, so that in fact we can rest assured that our willing, once we're glorified, will never go astray. But as far as what the will itself is, it remains that power to do otherwise. Whereas whereas Aquinas, when it comes to this beatific vision, will say no. The will in that case is no longer free, because in beatific vision, the goodness of God is presented to the intellect in such a way that it is unqualifiedly choice-worthy. There's no possible way that anything else could be deemed more choice-worthy. And so the will, so to speak, is just completed. It can't do otherwise. So that's a big difference between Aquinas and Scotus on the will. So anyway, sorry, I got on a soapbox a little bit, but I'm gonna stop here. But the idea is, so voluntarism is this idea of a relative emphasis on the will over the intellect, and we can see this playing out both in the God case and in the human case. Whether this ends up being really bad for theology, I think, is still an open question. I mean, I've developed a reading of all this that is meant to be more moderate, more in touch with the Catholic intellectual and spiritual tradition. But as you and your viewers probably know, Pope Benedict XVI in his famous Regensburg address actually singled out Scotus for criticism as an example of a Christian intellectual who, in his mind, unfortunately absorbed some of the radical voluntarism of certain Islamic theologians in the Middle Ages. Now, I have great respect for Pope Benedict XVI. I don't quite go along with him on that particular reading of Scotus, but it is there. It's there in the water of Catholic theological circles, and it's good to know about, even though I think, this is what I've devoted a lot of my scholarship to, that we don't have to go that way. And given that he's a beatified, given that he is a blessed, given that he's been reverenced, especially among Franciscans for centuries, we shouldn't attribute to him views that are worse than we need to, based on the texts.
And now, wasn't this in some of the definitions? I forget where I read this or listened to this, that in the Council of Trent or in Vatican I, definitions were made in such a way to allow the freedom to choose the Thomistic understanding or the Franciscan theses.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, this has always been an option, and Thomas liked to point out that the Summa Theologiae was the the most consulted texts at Trent, and rightfully so. I mean, this is my celebration of Scotus is not meant to take anything away from St. Thomas, but yeah, as far as dogmatic definitions, the Scotus distinctives were always options. Yeah.
Right. They worded the definitions in such a way that you were free to choose either opinion, and they'd both be in line with orthodoxy, the Orthodox teachings.
Yeah, one thing, Scotus relative to Aquinas is a minor figure now, but throughout not just the Middle Ages, but throughout the early modern period into the 19th century, Scotus was a really big deal, and there were. In the 17th century, there's some commenters who say, the Scotists outnumber not only the Thomists, but also the nominalists, outnumber those schools combined, which is unfathomable now. But yeah, at one point, Scotism and the Scotist tradition was just an extremely prominent part of Catholic theological thinking.
Yeah, and isn't he still wouldn't Aquinas as well as Scotus both still be predominantly Aristotelian in their views?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, sometimes Scotus is read as being more closely aligned than Aquinas is with the Augustinian resistance to Aristotelianism. But it's just clear on every single page of Scotus that he is thinking with Aristotelian tools and concepts, and didn't have quite his project when it came to Aristotle was a little different from Aquinas's, because Aquinas, we could think of him as second generation Aristotelian. His teacher Albert the Great was, the most important probably commenter on Aristotle in terms of like making it palatable for Christian theology. Aquinas, the greater theologian and philosopher than Albert, was able to elevate that project in a really profound way. But although there was still controversy that lingered, it was like Aristotelianism was here to stay by the end of the 13th century. And so Scotus didn't have quite he didn't have the burden, so to speak, of trying to like argue for Aristotelianism or make sense out of it. He just could use it because it was just so much in the water.
Okay. And because that makes sense, because a lot of people who want to be, true, or they feel like they're true scholastics or true Aristotelians, they can feel free to use Blessed John Duns Scotus and his interpretations of different things, because he's not departing radically from Aristotle, or even I guess in a lot of ways not departing much from St. Thomas Aquinas. You would say they're overall way more similar than they are different, correct?
Yeah, yeah, and especially relative to what Catholic intellectuals have to deal with today, in terms of this, this radical pluralism of schools of thought, many of which are hostile to Catholicism. When we think from a contemporary perspective, it's sort of the whole landscape of intellectual culture. If we think about it as like some sort of spectrum, Aquinas and Scotus are going to be like right here relative to the whole spectrum of thought. They're almost as close as you can get. Now, it's only when we're like really enmeshed in these late scholastic disputes where we begin to see how they differ from each other. But at the vantage point of the 21st century, for the vast majority of Catholic intellectuals, we got to think of these two as allies, as on the same team, even if they do disagree with each other about stuff, but those differences aren't nearly as important as what they have in common. The Aristotelian stuff is one of these, the idea that there is such a thing as natural law, that by reflection on the natural purposes or teleology of things, we can derive moral norms, or at the very least learn about what is objectively good and bad for human beings. Both Scotus and Aquinas are on that team, team Aristotelian naturalism. That's a good team to be on. They hash things out differently. They understand the relationship of God to nature slightly differently. But by all means, think of them both as resources. Study them both. Maybe you're going to prefer St. Thomas at the end of the day, but that doesn't mean you're not going to learn something about Scotus along the way.
Right, makes sense. And I'll talk about their understanding of divine simplicity, how they're similar, how they're different, and then also Haeceity, whatever order you think is better to move in. You take it and run with it.
Yeah. Let's talk about Haeceity first, because this is one of Scotus's most innovative contributions to metaphysics, and it's related to the Aristotelian stuff too. So this is going to be a little abstract, but think about, we talked a little earlier about the definition of an essence, and how like an essence, like human being, has these this structure, rational and animal. And then of course we can take animal and we can identify the structure of that, a sentient living substance or something like that. And then we can, analyze down and down and down until we get a whole Aristotelian definition of an essence. So a human being is a rational, mortal, sentient, living, material substance, something like that. All right. Now, one question that Aristotelians in the Middle Ages asked themselves and debated over is, if something like humanity is an essence that many individual things have in common, all human beings, what is it that makes an individual human individual? We know what makes an individual human human, is that's the essence that we all share. So what makes them individual? So then there was a sort of, philosophical industry of giving your answer about what is the principle of individuation, as it was called. Now, it should be said, because Scotus is sometimes very erroneously described as a nominalist, it should be said that only realists about universals will care about the principle of individuation. Because if you're a hardcore nominalist like William Ockham, you'll say there's no problem here, there's no question here, because the only things that exist are individuals. So there's nothing like a human nature that's common to all humans. So nominalists don't have to answer the question. So anyone who takes up the question, by that fact alone, we know that they are in some sense, a realist about universals. So Aquinas takes up the question. Scotus takes up the question, but they give very different answers. So Aquinas gave this, you might think of it as, kind of more standard Aristotelian answer, that the principle of individuation is matter. So our essence is human, that's shared by all humans, but the particular matter in which that essence is realized is distinct from all other individual human beings. It's our own. It's what makes us the individuals we are. Now, Scotus criticized that view because although the matter that right now sort of makes up your person is yours and yours alone, it, of course, is you're swapping matter in and out. It's not your particular chunk of matter right now that is making you the individual you are. There's given the form that you have in your human form of life, you're able to take in material from other sources, expel material, and so on. There's also the question for Scotus of, on Aquinas's view, what makes some particular chunk of matter individual, an individual chunk of matter? So it's like, assuming that we have individual chunks of matter, then yeah, maybe they could play the role of individuating, but we still need to ask the question, well, how do we get individual chunks of matter? So the same question arises. We just kick the can, so to speak. So what Scotus does is he says, it can't be matter. It's got to be some additional component of the essence that makes an individual human being the individual he is. So you would have everything that is common to human nature, and so would I, but then you would have this extra essential feature, your gene-ness, and I would have my Tom-ness. And so we could imagine God like surveying all the possible humans, not just like surveying human nature, but surveying human nature as contracted with the thisness of Gene, and human nature as contracted with the thisness of Tom. And so making choices, before the foundations of the world. And St. Francis de Sales has beautiful reflections on God's choice of you in your individuality before he made anything. We can really, Scotus gives us this theological and metaphysical tool for actually thinking about this in a rigorous way. Like, yeah, it's because my Tomness is part of my individual essence that God can and does understand it prior to any decision about whether to bring a world into existence that includes me. So then every individual, not just human beings, but every individual thing that has a nature that can be shared by many, but is nevertheless one individual thing, is going to have this distinguishing essential feature that Scotus sometimes calls haeceitas, or haecitas, that is in sort of butchered Latin, thisness, the thing that makes this individual. And as far as I can tell, I mean, it's utterly creative on Scotus's part. Even if you disagree with it, you think, well, he just invented this thing. Or, if you do agree with it, you think, oh, he discovered it. But he was the first to think of it. So it's kind of a nice thing. And it's, even if, whatever you make of it at the level of pure metaphysics, the emphasis here is that Scotus really cares that God has an understanding of every individual in their individuality. And that's I think the takeaway, even if you're a little skeptical about thisnesses as a kind of part of your ontology. Like we should hold on to some emphasis on God's knowledge of us in our individuality. Yeah, so that's Haeceity. It's really, really cool.
Excellent. Do we have time for divine simplicity?
Yeah, let's do it. So this is controversial. This is probably the thing about Scotus that like bugs me the most. And like I don't know if solid enough on simplicity. I'd like to think that maybe it can work, but I don't know. So why care about simplicity? The idea for someone like Aquinas is that God is completely underivative. God depends on nothing for his existence. There are no components of God that sort of come together, and because of those components, God exists as a whole. Like all of these different types of composition would make God a derivative entity, and that's just like a non-starter, especially when we look back to Aquinas's 5 ways, and the first way in particular, we get the idea of God as a prime mover, that is something that is pure potency, lacking pure potency, is pure act, something that is pure act, having no potency whatsoever. So it can't, there's no way in which God can move from some state of less perfection to some state of greater perfection. But any kind of complexity or structure in God would entail that, in principle, God has some sort of potentiality. So Aquinas is led to deny all complexity in God. And simplicity is it's dogma. You can't there's no negotiating on divine simplicity for Catholic intellectuals, and I'm fully on board with that. All right, so now Scotus comes along, and he's moved by he's emphatic about divine simplicity. He argues for it, all over the place. He says God's simple. So the controversy is whether what he means by simplicity is good enough to stay within the bounds of orthodoxy. And here's where he gets a little bit maybe makes some compromises. So he's moved by the multiplicity of divine attributes. We say God is simple, yes, but God is good, God is wise, God is just, God is loving, so on and so forth. Now, the thing about these attributes is that although they obviously can go together in one and the same essence, it seems equally obvious that they're not the same as each other. God's goodness is not exactly the same as his wisdom, even if, nothing that is perfectly good would lack perfect wisdom, and vice versa. They're just not exactly the same thing. So what Scotus is trying to do is find a way to theorize the multiplicity of divine attributes in a way that is compatible with the simplicity of the essence. And so he develops this type of distinction that he calls formal distinction. And the idea with formal distinction is that it's supposed to be the kind of distinction that holds when in one and the same thing, it cannot in any way be broken up or taken apart. But nevertheless, there is some real difference of structure or aspects or parts of it. And so what Scotus says is God's wisdom and goodness, for example, they can't in principle ever be separated from each other. And yet they really are different from each other. So what we'll do is we'll say that they're not really distinct from each other, because that would contradict simplicity. But we want to say they aren't only distinct in the way that we think about them, because wisdom really is different from goodness. And so instead, we'll say that they are distinct in some way in God's essence itself, not really distinct, not merely mentally distinct, but formally distinct. Okay, so now the question is, when you compare Scotus to Aquinas, does Aquinas recognize this problem of the multiplicity of attributes in relation to the simplicity of the essence? And if so, what does he do about it? Now, yes, he definitely recognizes the problem. I mean, problem here, not in the sense that he thinks it's solvable, but he recognizes the at least surface level tension or paradox between the multiplicity of attributes and the simplicity of the essence. Okay, So now what Aquinas does is he says, like, yeah, they're not, when we say that God is good and we say that God is wise, we mean different things, and there's something in God that corresponds to that difference. In the Summa Theologiae, he doesn't have a ton to say here about exactly how that's supposed to work metaphysically. In his earlier commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences, when he's talking about this very issue, the multiplicity of attributes, he says that they really are identical with each other in the divine essence. Nevertheless, there is some sort of distinction that holds on the part of the thing itself, that is the essence, that is not only a product of our thinking about it. So he doesn't use the term formal distinction, but he does say that there's got to be some kind of differentiation within this simple essence in order to make sense out of the multiplicity of attributes. Now, some scholars, I'm one of them, but Alan Wolter, a Franciscan friar and great Scotus scholar of the 20th century, has argued that even though Aquinas doesn't have the term formal distinction, that type of distinction that he talks about in the Sentences commentary about something that is distinct on the part of the thing being distinguished really is a kind of antecedent to Scotus's formal distinction. And so if you think that Aquinas is solid on simplicity, you should also think that Scotus is solid on simplicity. And vice versa, if you think that Scotus is squishy on simplicity, you might as well think that about St. Thomas too. But then, since no one's going to accuse St. Thomas of not being good enough on simplicity, the idea is, of course, then Scotus turns out to be okay. So that kind of argument that I've just run all hangs on a close enough similarity between Scotus's formal distinction and this distinction in Aquinas I was just talking about. Whether that's a correct identification on Wolter's part, I think, jury's still out. But I will say this: like, even if Scotus gets it wrong, gets simplicity wrong in terms of the technical metaphysics, it's clear that simplicity functions in an extremely important way in his overall theology, overall metaphysical theology. So, like in a book like his treatise on the first principle, which I recently wrote a commentary on, simplicity is just all over the place there. And so it's clear that he recognizes the need to maintain divine simplicity. The only question then is whether he's successful in working it out at the level of theory.
Okay,
does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, I've heard somewhere that Aquinas basically moves from simplicity and then moves towards divine infinity, whereas Scotus starts from infinity and moves towards simplicity. I don't know whether I heard that or if that's right.
No, yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. It's the infinity of the divine essence that is one way in which Scotus argues for simplicity. Yeah. Whereas you don't really get infinity in Aquinas until after simplicity. Yeah, I think that's right. But certainly there's a greater emphasis on infinity, divine infinity, in Scotus than there is in Aquinas.
And that's related to the term that I was thinking before, disjunctive transcendentals.
Yeah.
Is that, and that's related to, so I've heard it before said that maybe you'd explain this far better than I guess, that the concept would be univocal, but the mode would be analogical. No, the mode would be analogical, but the concept would be univocal, of, like, let's say love or beauty or truth. Speak about that. I might be way off base with how I'm presenting this.
Yeah. The let's take like finite being and infinite being. So we have a disjunctive transcendental would be the sort of transcendental that we were talking about earlier that pertains to every being whatsoever. But in this case, the transcendental is disjunctive in the sense that there are two types of properties and every being whatsoever has one or the other. So the pair transcends all being. So one of these is like cause and effect. Infinite finite is another one. Prior and posterior in perfection would be another, and so on. There, all kinds of these. But the one that matters most to Scotus is the finite infinite distinction. So from the level of like pure metaphysics, Scotus thinks that the most accurate or richest concept that we can have of God is infinite being. And then the most general concept that we have of a creature is finite being. So now I look at the relationship between these two. Obviously, the concept of finite being is not exactly the same concept as infinite being. And so these two are only analogically related. What do they share, though? Well, they share the concept being. So if we look at the being itself that is a constituent of each concept, we could say, yeah, that is exactly the same in each case as applied to creatures and as applied to God. But being has these, call them modes, where we could have being in its finite mode, being in its infinite mode, and there the relationship would not be univocal. It would be, analogical or equivocal or something like that. But yeah. So good. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another important Scotus distinctive, the disjunctive transcendentals.
That's what I was trying to say an hour ago. When I said transcendentals, I meant the disjunctive transcendentals, because then we could kind of see how Scotus holds to analogy and also univocity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, Scotus, and when he defines univocity in the Ordinatio 1, distinction 3, he says, I maintain that not only are words used of God analogically, but also some are used univocally. So even in the context of arguing for univocity, he's taking for granted that so much of our language is merely analogical.
Right, and that's a big misunderstanding for people to clear up.
Yeah.
A lot of fun. That the hour just flew by. I love learning this stuff.
I can't believe an hour's gone by.
and you made great sense of all this and breaking it down for someone here is truly just trying to wrestle with all this. But it really great. How do we give people? Where do we send people to find your information, your book, Ordered by Love, all your other works? Where do we send them?
Yeah, well, thanks. That's really generous. The book, it's called Ordered by Love. It's an introduction to John Duns Scotus. Angelico Press, there it is. Published last year, so it's almost exactly a year ago. So it's still fresh. Then if you want to learn more about kind of what I'm working on right now, you could go to my website, thomasmward.com. I mentioned the treatise on the first principle that I translated and wrote a commentary on. That's coming out like probably in a month or two. And that, to me, that is like Scotus's magnum opus when it comes to arguments for God's existence and arguments for divine attributes. It's such a beautiful little book. It's very challenging. It's such a beautiful little book. Hackett is publishing it, so it's actually going to be affordable. So yeah, stay tuned for that. You could join my mailing list so that as soon as that's out, you'll know about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Ward. I guess one more time for clarity, just to let everyone know that Catholics are free to embrace Scotus's positions on these topics. They were never condemned. They were never formally contradictory to tradition, denounced by the magisterium. A Catholic can feel free to study Blessed John Duns Scotus and feel safe about adopting his opinions. Is that accurate?
Amen. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. Have a great day.
Yeah. Thanks. You too, Gene.